news, ops, and a little bit of paranoia. Welcome to the Iron Sysadmin Podcast. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's episode of the Iron Sysadmin Podcast. I'm your host, Nate, and I'm joined by two of our usual co-hosts, Mark and Jason. Jason, oh, now he's got his video on. Thanks for waving. And we have a very, very special guest tonight, Mr. Chris Wright of Red Hat fame.
Hey there.
If you don't know who Chris Wright is, I'll let him tell you himself.
I get the honors?
Yeah, sure.
So many honors.
So I'm Chris Wright, and I'm CTO for Red Hat. And I think a lot of people wonder what that means. So in the CTO world, there's different ways you can slice and dice that role. What I do is technology strategy, pretty simply. And it means I get to spend a lot of time thinking about technology, the impacts of major trends across the industry for our business at Red Hat. And certainly based on the work that we do at Red Hat, that means a lot of time also spent looking at community open source software development communities and things that are happening in the innovation space of all the cool projects that come out of open source communities. So a lot of cool things.
Pretty cool. That sounds like a great job to have, I got to say. And it really does make me and maybe some of the viewers curious. How does one become CTO of Red Hat? How did you get there? How did you manage to work your way to that position?
I can tell you with total honesty that it was a series of events that I didn't start out with a plan. So there wasn't, way back when I set my aspirations to a very specific goal of becoming CTO for Red Hat.
9-year-old Chris, that wasn't what you told Grandma you wanted to do when you grew up.
It's
Grandma,
not.
I want to be CTO.
No, in fact, I've been in the computer industry for, I guess, a quarter century, and which sounds like a long time when I say it that way. It's been a while. And I'm an engineer. I love software. And one of the things that I discovered over time was first open source and what an amazing experience to be part of an open source community. And it really drove a lot of passion for me and a great way to kind of just learn a tremendous amount. And then the other piece was just over time, I found myself working on projects and engaging with broader and broader parts of, I'll call it the business, meaning different parts of the organizations that I've worked in, not always at Red Hat. I've been at Red Hat about 15 years. So I think it's a combination of just a series of technology skills and experiences that I've had as an engineer and a technologist, combined with learning more and more about the business side and kind of being able to communicate the technical challenges to a business world and the business challenges to a technical world in ways that you're sort of bridging a gap. And, I think one thing leads to another, and suddenly I was in a role that I really, truly enjoy. And I feel really privileged to have such a role at a great company like Red Hat. And again, it's a series of events that you don't predict as you start out. In retrospect, you can draw the line backwards and it makes sense, but looking forward, it's hard to predict.
Yeah, I can completely accept that. I mean, I think there's probably so many career stories that have gone that way, even if you're not CTO of Red Hat, where it's just like, if you'd have asked me 5 years ago if I'd be working at Red Hat today, I don't know that I would have been able to answer. I don't know that I would have said, yeah, totally, that's my plan. But here I am. So, and
I actually like that. I mean, nothing wrong with having specific goals, certainly, but that there's an organic nature to life, and you sort of meander and you find your path. And I know for me personally, each of those steps was related to where I was coming from, the context that I was in. It tended to be an expansion of responsibilities, which was mostly about broader influence. And I was really, and I've been really drawn to, I have only two hands and there's only so much I can do. So it's, the broader the influence, the more you can feel like you're creating impact. And so I looked for ways to expand my knowledge. I've always been curious about the new things and ways that I can expand the impact of the way I spend my time. So I think maybe those two things kind of summarize those
Yeah, right,
meandering steps.
right, right. So you mentioned that you were an engineer, and you mentioned open source projects. I am curious, and it's of course one of the things that we wanted to touch on. What projects have you committed to? Like, what have you participated in, either that led you here or just in general? You know, like what are the things that you like working on? What are the projects that you've chosen to work with?
Yeah, well, I can kind of go through my personal history, and it's interesting because there's some repetition that maps to the repetition of the technology industry, where we sort of keep reinventing the same things over and over again, um, but better and more exciting each time. Uh,
We're so
I
excited.
I started in I was actually working for a telecommunications company, and I was responsible for the availability of the system that we were building, which was a largely proprietary system, but we used quite a bit of the open source toolchain. So at the time, we targeted a bunch of proprietary Unix platforms, but we used the GCC toolchain. And of course, the first thing you do is go to Sunsite and get the real tools that you'd want for your shell, and better versions of grep and awk, and like things that today don't sound very interesting, but at the time was like a really, really empowering as an engineer. And through that process of being responsible for the availability of the system, I stumbled across a project called Linux HA, which is high availability project.
Mm-hmm.
And I started contributing to that project first just by tuning into the mailing list, grabbing software, trying to make it work in my environment, tuning into the mailing list, and mostly just listening. And then I realized that I had a specific idea in mind, and I wrote a patch to introduce multicast into this system so that I could change the way heartbeats were managed across this HA platform. And the community accepted it. The experience of building something that I was interested in, finding that other people were thankful, where I really felt like I was talking to some of the brightest people on the planet that understood the challenges of HA systems, which I aspired to be one of those people. I didn't feel like I was one of those people. So just being able to connect and rub shoulders with those bright minds and then have my work accepted, I tell you right there, I was hooked. And then there's some interesting kind of steps that come after that, where working in HA has these notions of availability. Availability has things like, well, often there's a proxy or a load balancer that does distribution across a set of members of a cluster.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some security isolation that could be interesting to ensure availability of a system. So I started working in some slightly different adjacent areas, and I got a job at a company that allowed me to spend all of my time working inside the Linux kernel. And I focused initially on HA, and then subsequently on security. And the interesting thing about the HA project, which it started with something that's still around, which is IPVS, virtual server project, but also there's something called Linux vServers. And what's interesting about Linux vServers is, if you fast forward to today, where we talk a lot about containers, there's some heavy overlaps in the functionality that was in the vServer project to what's in today's modern container runtime environment, which is mostly rooted down in the Linux kernel. And I was doing it for different reasons, which is more about security isolation, which led me to a security project, which I helped create, which is the Linux security module infrastructure in the Linux kernel, which led to the creation of what's now known as AppArmor, which is a project that I directly worked on, and another project called SE Linux. So I spent quite a bit of time in the Linux kernel. I became the stable kernel maintainer along with Greg Crow-Hartman. And then I found that in my security world, isolation could be improved if you leverage these new hardware extensions called VTX, or in the early days, Longhorn or LT extensions. And VTX is today what you would think of as virtualization. And
cool.
The reason I got into virtualization was because security and this HA vServer world which, it's just sort of funny that virtualization led me into cloud, cloud led me to OpenStack, led me to some of the networking capabilities that are required. And in the beginning, I was working on HA for a telecommunications company. Fast forward to, say, 2012, and I was working in the context of virtualization, cloud, networking to produce something brand new for the telecommunications industry.
Right.
Which was, just a funny, all these things have these kind of embedded circles and full circles. So, along the way, I've touched a bunch of different projects. And today I was on a call with somebody who said, I've used Fedora since me, became the maintainer of the ASCII doc RPM. So I brought ASCII doc into Fedora, and at the same time, and the reason I brought it into Fedora was because I was the maintainer of the Git RPM for Fedora, because I was an early contributor to Git, because I was a kernel developer working with Linus on making Git work, which at the time was this very arcane system that had some obscure C-based binaries that you had to manually manage the internal index of the source code repository. And then people started writing these weird shell scripts around it to make it a little easier to use. And I was involved back in those early days. So I've touched various bits and pieces of projects. I spent the bulk of my time in the Linux kernel community, and often in availability, distributed systems, clustering, security type of and networking type of spaces. So
cool. That's quite the journey. Linux HA eventually became Red Hat Cluster Suite, didn't it? Or was it a piece of it?
So it's exactly there's an interesting long history in the HA world. In the early days, Red Hat had this project called Piranha. Mm-hmm. The end of Piranha is HA, Piranha. And the Linux HA project had this core piece called Heartbeat. Mm-hmm. And so the evolution of Heartbeat turned into pieces of Red Hat Cluster Suite, and that the world today has evolved, and I'm not as closely involved in it, so I'm not even sure.
Right. Yeah. I think with RHEL 6, we pivoted to Pacemaker.
Yeah.
So in the RHEL 5 days, I was working in higher ed, and one of the things I was tasked with was building a highly available virtualization cluster on Xen. Right. Yeah. So a lot of the pieces that you're talking about, I'm like, I remember those. I had to deal with those. I don't really miss those days.
Yeah.
That was the days when your clusters were like, it felt like if you poked them the wrong way, all of your infrastructure was going to go down. But if your infrastructure went down on its own, it would pick itself back up again. So it was this balancing act of complexity versus high availability. So yeah.
I just remember the run books of crazy scripts you have to run every time something went wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
All those things still exist. Just in slightly different form factors.
Now a lot of that is masked behind Red Hat virtualization, and we don't have to look at it anymore, but it's all still there.
Well, we were looking at the HA stuff at Merck back when I was a Linux engineer there, and this would have been the RHEL 4 into RHEL 5 days. Okay. So the question for you, Mr. Wright, did the web-based cluster controls for RHEL 4 and RHEL 5 ever actually do anything? Because I don't think that ever really worked. It claimed to be a friendly web GUI to manage your clusters, and half the controls, like you felt you were typing into the void. If you went to the command line with RHEL 5, you could make HA sort of work.
Right.
We just might have been bad Linux people at the time too.
You were definitely bad Linux people.
Good Linux people in that era didn't use the GUI mark.
Well, we had this mandate though that our Charlotte Control Center, the C2C, that's where our production data center was. They wanted all these single panes of glass, and they wanted as much web-based as they could. So if a vendor claimed to have a web UI, that's it better work. Yeah.
So I can't answer that, and the reason is RHEL 4 predates my time at Red Hat.
Yeah.
I started at the beginning of introduction of RHEL 5, and I came in actually to Red Hat as one of the kernel engineers that had done a lot of the infrastructure work in the Xen project. So I came to Red Hat as part of the lead of the Zen team to help turn Red Hat into a virtualization company. So by then I was not focused on HA, but what's interesting about that time frame was leading up to that, you had these projects that did things called SSI, single system image. So it's like take a big cluster, make it look like one computer. And there was a specific project in the Zen space, or company in the Zen space, that was taking a collection of computers and using Zen, the hypervisor, to turn that collection of computers into something that looked like one large computer, which was sort of interesting to me because at the time, the world was starting to say that the better way to do this is scale out and have a large collection of smaller computers and let them run independently and just acknowledge that you're running this complicated clustered system. And it's just, it's only a matter of time that we come back around to this single system image idea, I'm sure. And today the cloud is the bulk expression of scale out, highly distributed system. And it's all about manageability and management tools that make it seem like you can think of it as one system, but the internals are lots of independent VMs and ultimately servers running all of your applications.
Yeah, you're reminding me of all these transitions I had to go through where we had highly available Zen, and then Red Hat pivoted to KVM, and we're like, okay, well, Red Hat's going that way. We can't stick with Zen. We're going to have to go to KVM.
But KVM is so much better.
It is. Oh. It is. I'm not complaining necessarily. But the first cluster I had to build, so the Zen cluster was built by my predecessor, and then I had to build the KVM cluster, which is essentially a clone of the Zen cluster with KVM underneath instead of Zen. Mm-hmm. And then Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization hits the scene, and Red Hat's talking all about Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization, and I'm like, we really should be moving to this. So we picked up Rev with 3.0, and that was a mistake. I hate to say that on the air, but I mean, there's a lot of people that would probably agree with me. Yeah, right, exactly. There's a reason why when I was in that panel at Summit, I said .0 releases are a thing that you test with and not put in production. But
I think anyone who's ever worn a pager or been on call in any way, shape, or form gets that.
Yeah.
Don't put the .0 in production.
No, we did. We shouldn't have, but we did. But yeah, 3.0, and then we were on Rev ever since from there until I left the college. So luckily that had a much longer lifespan than Zen or KVM did.
So I'm going to toss you in the Wayback Machine, Chris.
All right.
And no, I'm going to ask you the same question that I ask a brand new accelerators candidate, right? How did you first get exposed to open source? And what would you say the coolest thing you've ever done, like a single instance with open source, has been?
I was first exposed to open source in that time frame when I was doing telecommunications work, worked for a telecommunications company. And the first thing I was exposed to was the tool stack. So I was using GCC, bin utils, all the stuff that comes with the GCC tool chain. I didn't necessarily know that it was open source actually when I was first using it. It just was.
It was there.
We didn't use the Sun compiler. We used GCC, and it required somebody to tell me, hey, actually, you should read this thing. It's called the GNU Manifesto, and it'll help you understand why GCC is so cool. Like, okay, that's interesting. And then, of course, Sunsight had all the often open source tools that were available that, again, I didn't fully appreciate what that was. But the thing that really shifted it for me was in that environment, I had Spark stations, we had refrigerator-sized computers, all of which ran variations of Unix platforms. And I absolutely loved it. I loved Unix. I loved working with all these different systems. I learned a lot. It was really fun. It just had this one problem, which was I couldn't afford a $20,000 machine to put in my basement. And a friend of mine was working at an ISP and said, you can get this thing called Linux and you can run it on a PC. You just have to download these 50 floppies and pick the letters of the alphabet for the packages that you want, so you don't have to actually download all 50, but make sure you get the dependencies right so you don't spend time building something that actually doesn't boot. So I pulled Slackware off the internet through dial-up and loaded it onto a PC, and suddenly I had this Unix environment that I was familiar with on a PC. And then I realized that I actually had the source code, and I could look inside the operating system, which to that point I had never been able to look inside an operating system, and I was always curious what was in there. So that's how I got really exposed and started. And I'll never forget it. At that time, we had a product that came out that was based on FreeBSD, and one of the executives at the company saw the splash screen boot during the boot up process that says FreeBSD, and he just went ballistic, like, you can't put free in a product. So we had to go in and hack out free in the FreeBSD.
But you could, because ironically it was open and free.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the early tension of what does it even mean that it's freely available, and where's our value add? So as far as the coolest thing, I mean, there's different kinds of cool things. So I had just a basic router at home that was from my ISP, which I discovered I could, build my own cable, connect to it, and then upload firmware images onto it that were Linux based, and I could hack the router and make it do what I wanted. And that to me was just fun and cool, because it was this piece of hardware that I suddenly had control over. I depended on for my daily life. And the reason I cared was it had a memory leak, and over time it would suddenly freeze and I'd have to go reboot the thing. And I thought that was annoying. And I thought if I could put a more modern kernel, which actually had, it's sort of dated, but the firewalling tools in Linux have gone through various incantations. And so in the early days, you had IP Masquerade, firewall admin tool, and then IP chains, and then IP tables. Mm-hmm. So it allowed me to go from IP chains to IP tables, which brought in all these new features, which I started to be able to do more interesting things with the networking in that box, just because you could hack your own cable and download a firmware image to the system and take control. But the thing that was probably the most interesting work that I did, also the most frustrating, the hours of my life that I will never get back experience, was porting the Zen hypervisor and paravirtualized kernel to a 64-bit SMP machine. So at the time, x86 was almost exclusively 32-bit. You had the early days of the first few AMD 64-bit chips. 32
bits is all anybody will ever need.
That's right.
It's a lot of bits.
Yeah, 256K of RAM's plenty too. It required deep understanding of hardware that I hadn't had levels of the hardware that I hadn't had to get to before, and the arcanes of the boot up process, bootstrapping a processor, setting up things like interrupts, and being able to communicate between processors to launch the next processor. And there was a bug that I was debugging, and that bug that I was debugging happened exclusively in these handler routines that were entrance and exits from interrupts, and they're all written in assembly. They're not that long, maybe 30, 40 instructions per function.
Yeah, but it's assembly.
But it's assembly. And
I've written assembly. It's not easy.
It's definitely arcane. It's not easy. And you're in this weird environment where you barely have enough to display stuff on the screen. So I had to write this funky little display handler, create this little debug stub, and then spit out random garbage that was reflective of what's in a register, and then single step through registers by changing the assembly code to put a loop after each subsequent instruction to figure out where I was getting stuck in this few lines of assembly in this early stage of the platform. And it really was single stepping through instructions, but you didn't really have a debugger. So you just had to toss
You
hex
had to
bits
do
on
it.
the screen and hit. You'd know it hung when it paused because it hit the basically the forever loop that I would insert at each next instruction as I got there. That process was so deeply tedious. Those are the hours I'll never get back.
Yeah.
But the end result was so satisfying because eventually we figured out what the problem was, and the what came after that was now we suddenly had a 64-bit SMP hypervisor and per virtualized kernel that was brand new, and that's a pretty spectacular feeling. And in the end, it was actually somebody else who found the real bug that was the showstopper from getting us that to the point where that completely booted, and who. So that's part of the community collaboration where I was stuck in my basement, literally hacking on code and single stepping through these assembly routines, and I learned a tremendous amount. And I felt, you kind of feel like you're really running the machine. Like I understood literally each instruction. I understood exactly what was happening, and that was just really satisfying. It's a really cool experience.
Was that a paying gig at that point, or you were doing that was open source, contributing to it for the betterment of humankind?
That was a paying gig, and so I had an awesome job where I was able to work for what's now known as the Linux Foundation, but at the time it was called OSDL, or Open Source Development Labs. And the thing that was so awesome about that job was my job was just make Linux better. So it was a paid job where we didn't have a commercial product or outlet as a nonprofit organization whose goal was just to make Linux better.
Make it better.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so that was pretty spectacular thing to be able to work on. And
sweet.
Yeah.
So Josh from the chat has 2 questions for you.
Sure.
Do you remember what the router ran? Was it OpenWRT or DDWRT? He's a bit of a hacker himself.
Yeah.
If you remember,
it was neither OpenWRT or DDWRT. I'm not going to remember the name of the the firmware loader is Atom 7. The project that I pulled from to create the image that I put into the Atom 7 firmware loader, I don't remember anymore. But I looked at OpenWRT and I don't remember anymore why it didn't fit. It was probably a hardware compatibility issue, or it was ported to this chip, not that chip. And I didn't want to spend the time trying to take on that port. But it was an early action tech from probably, might have even been the 90s. Long time ago.
Yeah.
Long time ago. Distant galaxy, far beyond the Milky Way.
Right.
Yeah.
He also wants, he has another 2-parter, and it kind of goes along with what we're talking about anyway. But he'd like to know, what has been your favorite part of being the CTO of Red Hat, editorializing from Uncle Mark, other than being on the Iron Sysadmin?
Yeah, right.
And what is a home project you're working on?
All right. Well, my favorite part of being CTO for Red Hat is the work we do at Red Hat is spanning across all these different open source communities, and we get to work in a lot of new technologies. And my job is, sometimes I joke about it or sort of tease myself, say I'm buzzword compliant. But my job is to live at the sort of edge of technology and where things are going, and that's just for me, it's a very enjoyable space. I love technology. I like change. And I love what we're building in open source communities to impact really the world, the way things are built, the way businesses run, the way technology is delivered. So that to me is probably the most satisfying or exciting, interesting thing about my role. My home project is something that's going to take some time because I'm trying to get my kids to be a part of it. And that is, I have a Jetson Nano back here on the shelf behind me. And my intention is to work with the kids to train it's a NVIDIA platform with a little GPU in it. Develop a system where we're training that deploying a train model on that system that will recognize our dogs and use that to open the door. So we can let the dogs in and out of the house without having to have people involved. And I know that there's a lot of steps in the way of what we have to do, which include like physical. We have to get servos and motors and move things. That's non-trivial. And the part that's really going to make it slow is my kids aren't that excited about it. And they're like, Dad, that sounds so boring. But that's the home project. That's what I'm trying to get my kids.
The dog out. Why do I need a robot?
Exactly.
Who let the dogs out? The robot. The robot. Who let the dogs out? The robot. The robot. I think that would be awesome. How old are your kids, Chris?
They are 12 and 14.
So that can be a great age, or that can be the age where they're like, they don't want to be seen with you, depending on the mood they're in.
Right.
Yeah, it goes both ways. And they're not that excited about technology as sort of a maker hacker. They're happy to consume it. You know, they spend
to play
all day
Fortnite and whatever.
Yeah, but
Nate's
not as excited about the hacking part of it. But I'll try.
Yeah.
Cool though. I've got a almost 10-year-old she's just interested enough in technology, but she's not interested enough to really spend a lot of time learning it. So like little things that I can sit down with her and do, like I taught her to solder, for example, and she was just like amazed. I can solder now. This is cool. But I sat her down to build just a little Raspberry Pi system, and she lost interest as soon as I started writing the image to the SD card. Right? So it's like I got to pick my battles there. So
a friend of mine gave me I can't remember the name, but it's basically, it looks like a watch, but it's some kind of jewelry. And you can stick a little USB cable and then program it. And then it blinks lights in various ways. And when you put two near each other, they can blink based on how you programmed it. So you can sort of recognize each other. I've got 2 daughters. And that was actually really fun because the crazy part of it, the part I'm not so sure I'd recommend, was I'm pretty sure the SDK was either C or C++. I can't remember which. In either case, there's a lot of obscure semantics that, like my youngest daughter at the time, spelling was, she's young enough that spelling wasn't a strength. So just figuring out the words was tough. But they were able to program that thing and make it flash and do, colors and patterns. And it was instant gratification. And it was something that they kind of enjoyed wearing, at least for the hour or two that we played with it. And then eventually they got bored. And now it sits on a shelf somewhere. But the starting point was actually fun, and they didn't lose interest. They actually got sucked in. And I was like, ha ha ha.
I've got you now.
we shall break open the debugger next, because I have some kernel modules I need you to look at.
That's right.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you at the time I was in my basement with that loop code?
Oh, there it goes again. Mom, help. Dad's nerding out.
Yeah.
Oh,
I do hear that regularly.
All right. So, you have something, Mark?
Oh, I was going to move to I'm hogging the interview. I should let somebody else say something.
No, I was going to move on to the next question, to be honest. So
which is what I was going to do. Yeah. Go ahead.
So whether it's your daily Red Hat machine or your home machine, whichever one you'd rather talk about, what do you use as like your daily? Just I want to sit down and use a computer. Like, what is it? What's it running? What is it? Some crazy rig, or just like I just use an iPad, whatever.
And VI or Emacs.
Yeah.
Answer that one carefully, Chris.
I don't use an iPad.
There is a right answer.
I will say that. So I'll totally admit my workstation has gotten pretty boring. So as CTO, I spend a lot of time traveling. So I cared about a mobile, a lightweight laptop, so a mobile environment. And I've worked remotely for a significant part of my time at Red Hat. And working remotely, I typically had a laptop connected to a monitor, so I could actually have multiple screens and code and get stuff done. The more I traveled, the more the adjustment away from the monitor sucks so badly that I'd rather just always have the small screen. So I got to the point where I only use my laptop, which for a number of years, a number of variations has been a Lenovo X1 Carbon. So just kind of a vanilla lighter weight laptop. I today, over the last, since March 12th to be precise, I've been working from home, and I live near an office here in the Boston area, but we've all the Red Hatters have gone out of the offices and gone back to working from home, or gone to working from home. And so today I actually have my laptop connected to a monitor, and now I'm surrounded by cameras and microphones and lights, because I do a lot of web, the Zoom burnout or Zoom out that we were talking about before the show. Yeah. I do a lot of stuff on video conferencing, and even presentations that we're doing that are now virtual and remote. So I have this whole setup that's geared towards streaming content into OBS, doing my own post-production, and then shipping that off to our creative teams to help do the final work. So my laptop is a X1 Carbon that runs the current version of Fedora, which is Fedora 32. It's updated as of about 2 hours ago. And I tend to move to the next Fedora about 2 weeks before it's going to release GA. So it's very tail end of the beta stage. And that's just because I like to have something that's new, but not so new that I'm going to be in the process, be a part of the team that's debugging it. And I've been running Fedora I've been running Red Hat Linux and then Fedora since probably as far back as whatever that, maybe 97 or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually, I picked up my first Red Hat distro like 98 or 99. So
Red Hat Linux 5. Not
yes.
Enterprise Linux, Red Hat Linux 5.
We've talked about that before, as you might be able to tell.
The box is around here somewhere.
Yeah.
7.2 was a big shift, and I can't remember if glibc, I think. And then Red Hat switched to Red Hat Advanced Server 2.1 and introduced Fedora. And I didn't work at Red Hat at the time, but I was a Red Hat Linux person and then a Fedora person, and I've been using Fedora ever since. And I really like it. It's great environments. It's improved remarkably from those early days when, as much as you may have had stability issues, it was just the whole world was complicated. Getting drivers that, getting devices and hardware that was compatible with Linux wasn't easy back in those early days. Today, things work remarkably well. I mean,
remember
video,
Win
audio,
modems?
Stuff.
Oh God.
Say that again.
Do you remember Win modems?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Let's build a modem, but we're not going to have all the components in it. We're going to have the operating system do the heavy lifting.
But the modem
we're not going to tell people how it works.
The modem
can't do it on Linux.
The modem costs 3 cents to make, and we're going to sell it for 12 cents and make a ridiculous product. What's the word I'm looking for?
Profit margin.
Profit is the word I'm looking for.
You Ferengi, you?
No, I worked in dial-up tech support when the Win modem showed up, and I have so many levels of hatred for the Win modem.
I have to answer the VI Emacs question.
Oh, right.
Because now I'll lose half the crowd no matter what I say. When I was in college, I was working on my on a paper, and the paper I was writing it with LaTeX, and I was introduced. This was a BSD system. I was introduced first to VI and then to Emacs, and I was introduced to VI. I'd used it a little bit to write some notes, and this student came by and said, "You got to use Emacs." Like, okay, fine, I'll check that out. So I started Emacs, and I know there was nobody there. I had no idea what to do next. I couldn't figure out how to get any help or information, and I actually couldn't figure out how to exit. Like, all right, I'm a VI guy.
Including VI, that's a problem.
Yeah, right.
Somebody told me what to do, so that one I knew. I knew the arcane, language for whether you're shift ZZ, Wright, quit, whatever. Like I knew that because somebody had told it to me. The Emacs one, they just said, you should try Emacs. Like,
Okay, I'll try it.
Nobody told me any of the,
Now
like
what?
the meta key.
You quit by powering
nothing.
off the system.
Yeah, right.
I basically had to walk away from the workstation like, I don't know.
Maybe it'll time out eventually. I don't know.
When I
Kill
was,
I don't know if
window.
it's saved. Who knows?
So I've been a VI user, and more practically, I should say, a Vim user. And I learned some macros and was able to do some pretty interesting things, which would look like broad global search and replace across a bunch of code when you're doing something like refactoring code. And I learned a lot of that from Alviro, who's a kernel hacker who's absolutely mastered the arcane of probably starting with EX, or the precursor to VI, the non-visual version of the line editor version of VI. But I still use VI every day. It's how I take notes. It's how I work, review code. If I'm looking at code at all, I don't spend a lot of time writing code at this point. But so my workstation is Fedora, quite a few browser tabs, and a bunch of terminal windows that are running things like just, top, and I like to keep VMstat running just because I do. And
as Stallman intended. Oh yeah, because
Yes.
you have VMstat running, then that shows you the computer's actually working.
yeah, you need to know.
Exactly.
You need
In
to
your
know that.
head, you make the little beeps with your mouth as the VMstat goes boop, 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 boop. Yeah, come on.
I can remember back in those early days when it's like you fire up a program and then you're like, okay, how do I do anything? How do I close it? How do I get back to my terminal? Whatever, right?
yeah.
The days before Google,
There were a number of those.
you had to read the how-to.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
Now-
But now you're stuck in the editor. How do you get to the how-to?
How
Now-
to?
now
Man
it's
pages,
amazing.
man.
Yeah,
'Cause
man page.
my kids can pick up something and just figure it out. And part of it is the way we've approached computing. It's much more about
Mhm.
intuitive, just it's meant to be discoverable. And part of it is they're younger. They haven't had to stay up all night putting something back together after they broke it irreparably. So the fear of breaking something is not there. So that's
Non-existent.
push
Yeah.
random buttons until stuff happens. And they're like, oh, look, I figured it out.
Hey, it worked.
So
Why
which
is
is
it-
pretty cool.
Why is it beeping now? I don't know.
Oh
well, that'll fix it.
That'll fix it. I'm going to go watch something on my tablet.
Yeah.
So, what do you do for fun not in front of a computer?
Well, that's easy. I'm a cyclist. I love riding my bike. And so my time falls into three key areas. One is work, one is family, and one is riding my bike. Sometimes of the year, living in Boston, it's too cold and I like to ski. So I like a series of outdoor activities, I'll put it that way. Cycling is my main passion. I love skiing in the winter, do that wherever possible. I'll do a little bit of running. I live near an area that's got trails, so I can walk through the woods, and or run through the woods or whatever. So I'd say a lot of just outdoorsy stuff, but the main thing is cycling. And for cycling, I'm primarily a road cyclist more than a mountain biker. And it's been a little weird for the last few months because when the world just shut down, the first stages of COVID around here, I kept going out for bike rides. The group that I ride with locally, we all decided the right thing to do is ride independently and solo. So I go for these solo bike rides, and it was awesome because it's pretty congested around here and the roads were empty.
Yep.
And I'd send these, texts and tweets saying the zombie apocalypse is making it pretty fun to ride a bike. And then it just got a little weird and eerie and then slightly depressing. And then I just spent more time actually riding my bike inside using Zwift, which is a kind of a gamification way to do indoor cycling, just on an indoor setup that I have where I can ride my bike in the basement. And it's been more recently that I've gone back out, and now I feel, I got to have your mask because you never know when you're going to come across people. The roads are a little more crowded, and it's, I feel like I'm just sort of re-emerging back into life on a bike, and I can see
blinking
it's not
in
quite
the
the same.
sun.
Yeah,
right.
I actually got a sunburn the other day because I haven't been out
just-
enough.
Just came out of the vault. Sorry, my dogs are going crazy.
Crazy dogs.
My dogs go crazy when the doorbell rings and they cannot tell if it's the real doorbell or the one on the TV show that my kids are watching.
Yeah.
Right?
We have one dog that loves to bark at the TV. Certain things in the TV catch her eye, and she'll just bark incessantly at the TV, and we'll have to like pause whatever we're watching, take the dog out of the room, let her calm down, and then we can go back to watching TV. Pets.
Nerd culture question.
Lots of fun.
All right.
Star Trek or Star Wars? Or you can answer Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, come on. Does it have to be or? So
Not necessarily.
I'm one of those too. I like both.
You could be like the Taco Bell commercial. Why not both? Girl.
Yeah, I'll put it this way. As a kid, my first very favorite shirt was my Star Trek shirt. And it had my Star Trek emblem. It had sleeves and the color versus the
rank
cuffs and collar, and like it thing was, I love that thing. And so that was the TV show Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched it as often as I could, which I grew up in a world where we didn't get a lot of TV, so it wasn't like all the time, but that was definitely a favorite. But Star Wars is the first movie I went and saw in the movie theater. Mm-hmm. And talk about having your mind blown, and collecting the action figures and the models that you glue together of R2D2 and Death Star, and like all that.
So wait a minute, Star Wars was literally the first time you were in a movie theater watching a movie?
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. First movie I saw was Star Wars.
That is something.
That's the first one I remember was Return of the Jedi on the roof of the car at the drive-in.
Yeah, I didn't see them in theaters, but they were in heavy rotation on. Now I have not just the dogs, but the kids are coming in to see me. But they were in heavy rotation on just about every network television channel when I was a kid. So I can remember watching pieces of Star Wars all the time because you'd be flipping through channels and you'd catch, you were 2/3 of the way through and you're like, oh, I know this movie, I'll watch this.
Well, I was in 6th grade when Star Wars hit, and my dad took me to see it. And but sort of like what you were implying, Chris, I sat there the whole time like,
yeah, no, I was amazed. I absolutely loved it. The Star Trek movies, I didn't have that same experience. I didn't become an instant lover of the Star Trek movies. I like the Star Trek show. Mm-hmm. And then the more recent Star Trek movies, when J.J. Abrams was a director, actually I found those more enjoyable. However, I have to say, I discovered, I watch a lot of movies on airplanes, and there's this inverse relationship to how high you are off the ground, your altitude, versus your like tolerance or interest in movies. And I find a lot of movies awesome on airplanes, and I watch them elsewhere like, that is the worst movie ever. I don't know why. I enjoyed it. So not sure I would totally vouch for that, but I found J.J. Abrams kind of reintroduction of Star Trek interesting. What I've introduced to my kids is Star Wars. Mm-hmm. And they've really, really, really have enjoyed the entire series. We've watched them in order, chronologically, as they were released, in order as they were written, and that's been really fun to just, frankly, watch them again, but discover it through the eyes of them seeing it for the first time. So
yeah. One of my current projects, this is a very important project, is the Star Wars in chronological story order, every single piece of Star Wars content on Disney Plus. I'm on season 4 of the Clone Wars right now. By the way, the Clone Wars is not a kid show. It's a cartoon, right. Not a kid show.
Like so many cartoons.
My 21-year-old daughter and I'll be watching it, and she's seen the whole thing already. And something horrific will happen, and we'll turn to each other, and she'll be like, "Yeah, it's a kid show." I'm like, "No, it isn't."
It's kind of it feels like a kid show until you watch it, right?
Right.
It's terrible. I've ranted about that on the show before.
So Jason, you've been quiet for most of the interview because we had already prepared all these questions. So you are the only non-Red Hatter on the show who currently has the ear of the CTO of Red Hat. I'm just curious. Do you have any questions?
Oh, nothing earth-shattering. Red Hat's fascinating. It's someplace that I've kind of watched for the longest time, and maybe eventually I'll get in there. But it sounds like you're not cutting code or anything anymore. I've been sort of in a CTO role before, and you kind of lose all that. Do you find what I found was that I was able to get the same amount of pleasure from sort of getting behind my team and sort of paving the way for my team to be able to do great things as I was when I was sort of the lone guy doing things. Is that kind of where you're sitting now as well?
Very much so. The way I describe it is you're just hacking on different things. And there's code, there's sort of architectural levels, which is still very technical, but not literally writing the code. Um, there's also things like I'll call it hacking, but hacking an organization or trying to understand what it takes to get something done at an organizational level, and thinking through business challenges, which in in the in the time where I was just spending 100% of my time writing code or reviewing other people's code, but 100% buried in my laptop on my editor and on mailing lists. There was a whole set of business things that I found deeply, deeply uninteresting. And there's also been technology areas that I didn't really think were interesting at all. And then I found myself working on them and then discovered they're interesting. So in that same context of you think, I'm not that into pick your technology area, and then suddenly you get into it and you realize it's complicated and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I've discovered that each of the areas that I touch, there's a ton for me to learn, whether that's organizational, people, business, technology, architecture, and that's what I love. I love learning, and I really do enjoy being a part of a bigger, broader thing. And in an open source community, you're part of a community. In my role, I'm part of a leadership team that's bringing Red Hat, forward, and that in either of those cases, you're taking on big challenges and applying your skills and working with other people, and it's enjoyable. It's just that they're different things. So I feel like I'm hacking on different things right now, but I really do enjoy being working with a broader team and supporting these major efforts.
So what is that you can talk about? What is I guess the one thing that you're or technical or not, but what is the one thing that you're most excited about that's sort of present or up and coming?
It's hard. It's always hard to pick the one thing. And whenever I'm asked the one thing questions, I always say the one thing I'm most interested in are these three things, and they're connected because they fall under one umbrella.
The one thing's an array. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. It's a
nerd.
Infinitely long array. So there's a couple of things that I'm really excited about right now, and it's just for very different reasons. One is just the Kubernetes project. It's got so much interest and enthusiasm and excitement around the industry. It helps take Linux, which I'm just totally passionate about, from a single server operating system to this big distributed system in a way that improves, the ability to do quick development and put things in containers and deploy them at scale. And there's a lot of interest in building clustered systems. Is non-trivial. Distributed systems are hard. So creating big complex distributed systems is a cool thing. And I just love Kubernetes and what we're doing in that community, or the associated communities, and what we're doing with it at Red Hat. That one to me is kind of the right now. The thing that's emerging, which isn't brand new emerging, but it's part of an emerging world, is machine learning, AI. It's hard not to be interested in that. It's fascinating on a number of levels. There's the Skynet side. There's just the pure math. It's an interesting set of math problems. there's what's possible, especially when you get to unsupervised learning, where computers are starting to really help assist humans in ways that we're not really eh, taking full advantage of right now. Plus all the social implications of what does that mean? There's bias, human bias that enters into these systems, and then we think they're fine because it's a computer, but it's really trained with biased data and creating bias models. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in that space, and I think it's an important part of the emerging world of technology. And then the one that's most fascinating, more at a geek level, is quantum computing. And the reason it's so fascinating is it's just sort of a scientific marvel, and understanding how, like, think of it in the context of how quantum mechanics works, which itself is a very complex field, and the ability to create entangled states, and think of something as not just a one or a zero, but it's a probability distribution, and somehow harness that into compute power, and then that compute power is exponential with the number of qubits, such that a relatively small number of qubits maps to the number of states that you can manage with the molecules on or atoms on the planet to the number of atoms in the universe. And it gets kind of mind-boggling, and that we're not at that level of the number of atoms in the universe. We're not that far from starting to map to the number of atoms on the planet, which it's scientifically fascinating, and it's interesting to see how that compute could be harnessed to do things like help us discover, get insights into the medical world or material sciences, or things that need those highly complex models to even accurately model reality. So it's hard to put one. Maybe each one is in different spaces completely today, emerging AI and the future quantum, but and for very different reasons.
Imagine the cat memes that quantum computing would let us create.
That's right.
It's funny when you're talking about machine learning and talking about bias. There's a Star Trek episode in the old series about that, right? Remember the Ultimate Computer when Daystrom programs the M5 using his engrams, because he had to do that because he had to he couldn't just.
Huh.
It was he used that as a shortcut. Oh yeah,
it's pretty amazing. I've said this for a number of years, that how many things shows like Star Trek got right, and how many that they were just way off. Star Trek probably is one of the closest, but there's others, and I've used this in previous shows where things like what was it Neuromancer? I can't remember. There was a scene. Oh, it was in. No, I can't remember the name of the book. Anyway, there was a scene where it's like you're in this crazy futuristic world, right? Where people like jack into computers with their brain, but yet they're still payphones, right?
Right.
So like we don't have payphones anymore because we've all got phones in our pocket. The author just didn't see that as a thing. But Star Trek, I mean, like the whole idea of these little portable computers they carry around and the communicators and whatever, they're pretty close.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
I still can't get over the fact that Back to the Future got it wrong, and fax machines are not the default method.
I know.
Yeah.
They got the video chats on the wall in the living room right, though. They just got the year wrong. It was actually 2020 when that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. The second movie went all in on fax machines.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. No. In the Ultimate Computer, right when the M5 takes over the Enterprise, Spock starts to question Daystrom on the design, and Daystrom then reveals he's imprinted human engrams into the M5 circuits, creating what amounts to human mind operating at the speed of a computer.
Oh.
And he admits later he
That's
used
never a
his
good thing.
engram. Which, of course, once Kirk realizes that it's his engrams, he then uses that to talk the computer to death. Man, I wish I could talk computers to death.
This sounds
like Kirk could.
this sounds like a Star Trek episode.
And that was Iron Star Trek.
Yeah.
Episode 1.
All right, so we've been at this an hour. I feel like we could go on for another hour or two, but of course I want to be respectful of your time. So is there any final thoughts you wanted to give to the Iron Sysadmin audience before we transition on to the next segment of the show?
Sure.
I don't have any thoughts. I just want to say thank you. Thanks for listening. I mean, I hope there's something in here that resonated with you and you got something out of it. And I know for me, that sort of curiosity and then, sharing your enthusiasm has been a big part of what's brought me to where I am. And so I encourage you to stay curious and stay engaged and share your enthusiasm.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
This has been a great segment. I hope the viewers agree. I've enjoyed it.
Me too.
Heck yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, and we're gonna move on to our transition. So, folks that are in the live stream, just hang on. We'll be back as usual, and
we'll be back. Yeah, you'll
Mark,
see little Hamilton.
Mark
King
will
George. You'll remember you belong to me. I am not Jonathan Groff. I will stop now.
No, not as good. All right. So, thanks.
Not even.
we're back. Hey, folks.
Holla!
That was a fun time. I do hope that there is a chance we will have Chris Wright back on the show again.
He seemed to enjoy himself.
Yeah, I think so. At least I hope so.
I think it could happen again.
Yeah, that was fun.
Or we'll get Paul Cormier on. I mean, why not?
Yeah, right. We'll just go. Okay,
We'll have them both on together.
Who's next above Chris? Let's go there.
Yeah. Get Paul and Jim on at the same time. There we go.
Yeah, right. Totally. All right, so that was a good time. As far as announcements go, we have our usual Patreon update. We're making about $72 a month. That's before Patreon takes their tiny little cut. And now there's like actually a tax thing involved. Patreon has this whole thing going on about how they have to start taking taxes out now, which is whatever. Blah, blah, blah. Stupid government. So here's
they need to pay for the COVID implants somehow, right?
Yeah, you're totally right. I just realized I forgot to eradicate last names from our list of patrons. So
no! Yeah, luckily, but they can't see this yet.
Luckily, none of you can see it yet, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. But all right, so our list of patrons as it sits this morning when I pulled it out of Patreon is Solemn, spelled in that funny way. Erwin, Trooper Ish, Linux Sys 666, Gimpy B, Ryan, Mark with a K, Dementor from PowerShell on Linux, John, also known as John the Nice Guy, Mark with a C, Julius, Andy, Charles J, and 22532.
Hey, you two, how you doing this month?
Yeah, right.
I like two. He's a good guy.
He is a good guy. He was our earliest patron, and he remains a patron, which is awesome. So I'm not going to
22532, 2 for short.
2 for short. No, it's actually a reference to. I looked this up once. It's a reference to a hacking club, I think, if I remember correctly.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is cool. But yeah, before we even had like a real show and anything, he was one of our patrons. Reached out. It was one of the Slack channels I was a member of for another podcast. Was it Defensive Security? It might have been Defensive Security. And he found us through there, and he became a patron, and he's been a patron ever since, so that's awesome. Thank you. I don't even know if he listens to the show. Okay. For reviews, we don't have anything new, so folks, please leave us reviews if you would like to let us know how we're doing. We like reviews. We like to hear good or bad, so we know what we should change and what we shouldn't, so please go ahead and do that.
You could do one-word reviews. You could just say groovy.
Groovy or horrible. Although if you say horrible, I would like at least some explanation as to why.
Or how about horribly groovy?
Horribly groovy? Yeah, right. Yeah, that could work.
There you go.
That could work. Groovably? Do we... I don't know. Are there any conferences coming up that aren't canceled or that maybe have gone virtual that people can sign up for free? I know DEF CON went virtual and is free.
Everything is virtual.
Yeah,
right. Hope is virtual.
Is it free though? The question, right? So that's what I'm going for. I'm trying to spread the news of anything that I know of that's virtual and free.
Right? I don't know if Hope is free or not. I do know that I've gotten, I think, 3 or 4 separate emails now with keynote speakers, and then more keynote speakers, and then more keynote speakers.
So because it's a virtual, they can have a billion keynote speakers?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Dear conferences, you can only have one keynote speaker. That's what makes it a keynote speaker. The rest of them are just speakers.
Well, they have you can have keynote presentations where it's got several speakers in a row, right? But if there's 100 of them, then it becomes a problem. Yeah.
I think they're up to I don't know, let's see, 4, they're up to at least 8, I think. But I think it's more than that. I think they have 10 or 12 keynote speakers.
Is there a rule there? Now I'm going to ask Google.
Is there a rule about how many keynote speakers you can have?
Keynote speakers can you have?
As many as you'd like.
We're going to find out.
Yeah, Hope 2020 is not free. Very not free.
Very not free?
Not free.
Wow.
Yeah, it's $200 a ticket.
And it's virtual.
Yep.
I'm curious how that's going to work out for them.
Yeah. My son is a speaker.
Mm-hmm.
So
his is free, right?
So
I
here's
hope
an
so, 'cause
interesting.
I'm not paying for it.
Here's some interesting notes from a couple of places on the internet. And
About
because
how
they're
many
all on the
keynote
internet, it's
speakers
true.
you can have.
It says an opening keynote speaker is brought in to set the underlying tone and summarize the core message or most important revelation of the event.
Revelation.
Now we're a bunch of Baptists, right? If an event is held over a longer period, it is not unusual to have a different keynote speaker for each day of the event.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the way Summit is, right?
Yeah, Summit has
essentially a keynote each day.
Summit has several keynotes, usually per day, but then there's evening keynotes and then there's daytime keynotes.
And then this thing on Quora, but Quora is basically some guy's opinion.
Yeah.
These days, it's not uncommon to have multiple keynotes at a single conference, opening and closing, one each day, one each park day, one each track.
One each track, one each talk. There's a keynote for every talk.
Maybe you just call them keynote speakers so they feel better about themselves.
Could be.
Yeah.
The keynote for every talk.
I think we got keynote inflation going on.
Keynote inflation. That's totally what's going on.
I'm with Jason. There should be one.
There should be
only
one.
It's like Highlander. Have all the competing speakers who want to be keynote
There can be
speakers
only one.
fight, and whichever one gets to keep their head, that's the prize. They get to be the keynote speaker.
Yeah, so Hope has great. 9 keynote speakers right now. One of which is Cory Doctorow, which I would love to see.
Yeah.
And another one which is Jaron Lanier, which
It'll only cost you $200, man.
I will attempt to ride on my son's coattails.
Yeah,
he's going to get a ticket somehow, and I'm just going to use his.
That's just funny.
Just look over his shoulder.
It
can be on day one.
Coattails. All right. So, Mark, you have anything fun going on?
So I had a couple of things I threw on the agenda.
I see.
So I've got my home lab, right? And for my back-end storage, I have the Synology NAS thing. And for a kind of fun project I've been working on with the Linux firmware foundation people, it has to do with some stuff I'm doing with satellite right now. And it was dogging. It was going so slow. And so I would look in top and look in VMstat, and the thing was spending a ridiculous amount of time in wait states, which generally means you have an IO problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I start poking around, and I look on the NAS, the network settings on the NAS through the web UI, and the friggin' thing's at 100 megabits per second. And what I had done is I want to say about a year ago, I had moved it from my home office to behind the TV in the family room just to clear up some space. I'm like, oh, I'll just plug it right into the router and things will be good.
Sure.
Well, for whatever reason, the stupid thing just locked on to 100 megabits per second, and it was awful.
Oh, it's meant to be gig. That's the point. That's
it's
what you're saying.
Meant to be gig, right?
I get it now.
So I deep side shut my entire Rev infrastructure down and moved it under my desk, where it's directly plugged into the gigabit switch, which the Rev servers are plugged into.
Yeah.
And now the sucker's cooking with gas.
Kaboom.
It's actually megabit connections again.
You put it under your desk?
Yeah.
That way makes it enterprise ready.
Yeah.
It is enterprise ready, which also means if I'm not careful and I'm just stretching around with my feet, I could potentially kick the power button.
Oh my god.
Which will freeze my Rev lab. So I'm in great shape.
Right.
This brings
which
up,
then makes it a Sev 1 outage.
Under your desk. This brings up memories, right? So when I've talked before on the show about this little web host. This little web host that I worked at. Well, there were 2 admins there, right? And we basically, the office that they put the 2 of us in was small enough that we had only one way to arrange our desks, and that was that we had 2 straight.
That can be only one.
We had 2 straight desks along, one wall of the office, and then the whole rest of the office was like storage for all of our spare parts, which were like scavenged from all the dead servers, and like a coat rack where we put our coats, and that was like all the room we had. Well, underneath that desk was a very long power strip. Like one of these, it was meant to go on like a side rail of a rack, right? That's how long it was, right? And our desktops.
How long was it?
Our desktops were plugged into these things. Well, the assistant admin sometimes would stretch out his legs and hit the damn power switch on this power strip. And he would shut down both our machines in an instant.
Oh, man.
It was just like, you did it again, Sean, didn't you? Yeah.
Harsh. Harsh.
Yeah, so it was never good when that happened. It only happened a few times, and eventually we convinced the boss that we needed small UPSs for our machines in case the power were to go out, or he kicks the switch.
Hey. That's funny though, because like my desktop machine, I'll air quote it, my desktop is actually a laptop. So if I
Yeah.
kick the power for that, it's not going anywhere.
Built-in battery backup. Yeah.
Built-in battery backup. But so that was kind of cool though. And now my satellite server, and it's been running like a bit of a dog. I feel like I'm insulting my dogs. It's been
Poor
running like a
dog.
bit of a dog recently, and I'm like, oh well, I actually feel like I accomplished something with that, which is
Yeah.
good.
That is good.
I've also some of you might have read my blog series, World Domination with C Groups. Part 8, there was a critical bug fixed with SE Linux.
Yeah.
Some would say that the critical bug with SE Linux is that it exists, but you can hush your mouth if you say that. Critical bug was
Dan
fixed.
Walsh
that was
will cry.
Yeah. Let's not
Yes,
make him cry.
Dan Walsh will come after you.
He might. I like Dan Walsh. Did I tell you? Now I'm gonna Greg Scott here. I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole. Did I ever tell you about the
Clay
time?
Neusterhouse? You remember that,
Clay,
that time?
Clay Neusterhouse. Were you a Red Hatter when Dan Walsh was in New York yet, Nate? When we were at the user group meeting, or was that prior to your time?
I do not recall meeting Dan Walsh in New York, if that's
So
what you're
Dan
asking.
Walsh came to New York, and I was like some like teenage girl, like meeting like I guess today it would be like a K-pop star. And Dan travels with his wife, and there's a bunch of us nerds here basically worshiping her husband.
And she's
his
like,
wife,
what?
his wife is just like, y'all are like this with him all the time, and I just don't get it. Yeah. So
That's nice.
yeah, that was that. But so Dan Walsh, I was definitely fangirling on Dan Walsh, but what did that have to do with anything? Oh, right. So,
I don't know.
But my new
Set in Force
C
One
Groups blog, right?
That's all it took.
There was a bug with the SE Linux policy that was stopping C Groups V2 from working with CPU sets, which is now fully supported. So if you're into performance and you like control groups, or if you're into performance and you've never looked at control groups, again, I've got a whole blog series about them, and my latest edition will talk about CPU sets on C Group V2. So that's in marketing and legal review right now.
Oh, good.
And then finally, because I'm a crazy person, I'm playing EverQuest again.
I saw that, and it brought back funny memories.
One of my oldest friends, one of my college buddies, Jim, he and I got into EverQuest. My account that I'm using now is 14 years old.
Okay.
It is not my original EverQuest account. I
Yeah.
actually deleted my original EverQuest account at some point because I'm like, this game is stupid and I'm getting addicted to it.
I'm done.
So it's my second EverQuest account, which was created 14 years ago.
Yeah. So you're playing
but-
EverQuest like proper, not like some emulated server?
Correct, because what Sony realized, it's not Sony anymore. They're now owned by Daybreak, the EverQuest property.
Okay.
They have what they call progression servers, where they launch the server and it starts with just the classic content, like level 1 through 50, just the original zones. There's some of the stuff is modern, like you can see the new character models and stuff, and there's a couple of systems, like the experience isn't quite as slow as classic, but like you got to sit down and med. Most classes can't solo. I'm playing an enchanter, and I've never seriously played an enchanter, but it's hella fun.
Yeah.
Well, my friend Jim, he was on a Discord server the other day that one of our coworkers runs, and I haven't talked to Jim in a while. Actually, he and I get together, hang out every so often, and then we kind of drift apart. But he's one of these friends who, like, if I haven't talked to him in 2 years and we get together, it's like we never were apart.
Right.
We've been friends for that long. But he answered someone's question about database stuff because that's what he does for a living. He's a database nerd. And I noticed that Discord said he was playing EverQuest. I'm like, you're playing EverQuest? And he's like, yeah, I'm on a progression server that just started a month ago. So I'm like,
nice.
Holy moly. So I the next day I downloaded the client and activated my account. And
Is it free to play now? or do you have to
So
pay?
it can be free to play, but to play on the progression servers, you need to give them money.
Okay.
But it is worth it. It's $14 a month. It's
Yeah, I mean,
totally worth it.
EverQuest got so weird and muddy after all the expansions that it really. I mean, I left it long before all the expansions hit, but it turned into a whole different game. But there is this weird spot in my brain for EverQuest, and I don't know what it was about
Right.
EverQuest, but it was
It's
just it was this perfect. I felt like it was this perfect blending between an old school mud and a graphical game. Right? It
yeah.
still had a lot of elements with the chat window and the way you could interact with things via text, and the way the quests were set up and the way things ran. It felt so classic, so text-based mud, but
Well,
yet you had a graphical interface where you could interact with things.
So let's be completely honest about EverQuest at launch, right? EverQuest at launch had very few actual quests you would go on.
Yeah,
Like the actual epic quest lines weren't introduced until Kunark.
right.
So what EverQuest really is, especially in the classic mold, is you get together a party of adventurers, you find a camp or you find a zone or whatever, and you're basically just killing monsters for
Yes.
experience and treasure.
Yes,
And it's hard.
it is. It's hard.
Like the game, and there's some systems that, like for instance, when you used to die, you'd leave your corpse, and all your stuff would be on your corpse.
You'd have to go
And if you
find
didn't
the
get your-
corpse and
if
pull
you
it
didn't
back,
get your
and
corpse back in time,
it would go
you
away.
lose all your gear. You can,
Yeah.
right. It doesn't do that anymore. You do lose experience after level 6, but your corpse respawns with all your gear. So it doesn't kick you in the
That's
in
not
the where-
EverQuest
yeah.
then.
But it's almost well compared to a lot of the games. You still, if you're killed, you still respawn at your bind point, which could be halfway around the world.
Yep.
You still need to get a res to get experience back.
Yeah, but
it-
being bound in Freeport and dying in Quinos, I mean, there was nothing quite like the trek across the world that was ahead of you for the next 6 hours,
And
because
Kit
you
the
had to
Core
get
is
it done,
scary.
otherwise everything was gone.
Yeah, and Kid the Core is scary.
And Kid's Core is scary. Poor
Yeah.
Jason's over there like EverQuest.
Did Jason? Did you play?
EverQuest? No. I
You missed out.
I took a look at it. It didn't really hold my interest so much. I was playing MUDs at the time, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was much more interested in that.
Yeah, well,
and then,
EQ was, like I said, it was like this weird blending of a mud and a...
yeah.
and a
Outside of
graphical
a
game.
MUD, outside of MUDs, I think my first MMO would have been Warcraft.
Yeah.
World of Warcraft. I beta
Yeah.
tested that, and
Mhm.
then played it all the way up until the night that I would have gotten level 60, which was back in the day.
When
Back
that was
in
the,
the
when that
day.
was the top.
Yeah, so that night
Classic.
I had set it up. We were gonna raid in and we're gonna get my level 60 and all good to go. And I fired up my laptop and the screen wouldn't turn on. And I basically canceled work. Couldn't afford a new laptop. And I
Yeah.
didn't have anything to run it on. So
Yeah.
that's when I stopped playing Warcraft. And then I don't know, maybe two or 3 years ago, whenever it went free, I
Yeah.
fired it up and I'm like, I'll give it a shot. And I played for about 5 minutes and went, this is not Warcraft anymore.
No,
Screw
it's
this,
totally
and turned
different.
it off. It was garbage. It was
There
like
is...
it's the easiest thing in the world. It was like
They
there's no
did-
challenge anymore.
They did
Right.
restart, essentially, and they have a separate classic game you can play now. So I don't know
Yep,
if that
they do.
interests
Free.
you at
Gotta
all.
pay for that. No, I gotta
No,
pay
no,
for
it's
that.
not free.
No. I do not do well with MMOs.
Oh, right,
It's
because you
kind of
get
like-
sucked in?
It's kind of like crack cocaine,
Yeah.
which is exactly what MUDs did to me. So I quite purposely avoid those games like the plague.
Yeah, there was a point where I realized that EverQuest was taking up a whole bunch of my time, and I literally sold my account to a coworker and said, I don't want to play this anymore because it's bad for me. You can have it.
Well, the
Yeah.
problem is that you can't not do that if you ever want to get anywhere in the game. It's not possible to casually play an MMO
Yeah.
and get anywhere. You're always going to be behind. You're never going to be able to actually complete anything.
Right.
So
they had a 76% experience boost during from the Friday I started until last night.
Mm-hmm.
So I started at level 1 on July 3rd. This is going to sound crazy to you, Nate. Last night I dinged 38.
Wow, that is insane.
Right? And
EverQuest never went that fast.
No.
I mean, it took me months to get to like level 30 or whatever, maybe 20.
Right. And so there's two things going on. The experience progression, even without the buff, is a little faster on progression servers.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the 76% boost to experience
yeah, right.
was actually insane. But
I will point out there is an MMO that you can basically get everything in the game just by not playing it. I don't know what the name of it is. My wife was watching a video the other day.
EVE Online, probably.
This guy, this YouTuber, the Lazy Peon, did a video on this, and basically you fire the game up, and it is 100% on rails. The movement, the combat, every part of the game is on rails, and all it does is pop things up on the screen that you have to click on, and it constantly takes you to pages to pay for the game.
Nice.
He went from
that's not EVE Online.
He went from level 1 to level 100 without ever touching the keyboard in like a half hour.
Well, there was a little joke game written called Progress Quest, which literally, I mean, it's funny. It was basically to mock EverQuest, but it essentially plays itself. I'm gonna throw that in the show notes because it's pretty funny.
Yeah, we have talked about Progress Quest before, I think.
So, but anyway, the progression server for me, there's so much nostalgia there that I don't know how long I'll end up playing. I'm going to play as long as Jim's playing because for me it's a social thing with him, and we've got he's in a guild with some folk that I've only met online. But if he stopped playing, I'd probably bail, and I probably as every 12 weeks they're going to drop a new expansion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably good for at least a year or two because that's content I played in the original game that I never got to experience at that expansion's launch.
Yeah.
So there's some things I want to try. Like I want to try and get the Coldane Shawl in Velius, which was the second expansion. I never got to do that because I wasn't part of a guild that worked that content, and by the time that I could do it on my own, it was antiquated.
Yeah.
So whatever. But that's what I'm doing. So those are 3 fun things. Plus our D&D game keeps going.
Yeah.
Nate plays in that on Tuesday nights. That's been a lot of fun.
That has been fun. We burned down a building.
Lots of cheese.
Lots of cheese.
Whole lot of cheese on that map. So many slices of American cheese. No, I was using.
No, it was Munster. Remember?
It was Munster, right? Because it had the red border.
Yeah.
I was drawing orange squares and with the little red border to show where the building was burning. And one of the players was like, "That building is covered with slices of cheese," because like
because it looked like
deli cheese.
It looked like deli cheese, right?
It was funny. I got good players.
It is a good group of people playing that game, and it's good content. You're doing a good job with it. It's fun.
Thank you. Anyway, that's all I got.
So my Jeep is finally back on the road, or at least, I mean, it's still in the garage, but it's drivable again, which is,
It's street legal?
Well, I mean, that's debatable. Depends on what inspection mechanic you go to and if you pass a cop.
So it's not street legal.
Totally street legal, and that's the story I'm sticking to.
Because we're in kind of a vague place in the Commonwealth now anyway, because they've extended certain dates and stuff like that.
My gosh. Yeah, right. But the Jeep works again. I've talked several times on the show about how my Jeep was in pieces, and I just figured I would close up that story with yes, it works again, which is amazing. So that was fun. Took me, I think, 2 months to get from start to finish. But I had I had the engine torn apart, not like down to like crazy engine stuff, but like I had the whole top of it torn off to put on a new seal, and the whole bottom of it torn off to put on a new seal, and yeah, those kind of seals. That's what we did, and it was interesting. The other thing that I did recently, since I don't have to worry about working on the Jeep anymore with all my spare time, I finally moved all of my my web presence for both Underground and Iron Sysadmin and my Jeep site and a few other little things were all containerized in Docker on a CentOS 7 box on DigitalOcean. And I finally moved that to CentOS 8 on DigitalOcean in Podman, which meant I had to go from Docker Compose to something that supported Podman, because there is no Docker Compose on Podman. There is like, what's that?
So a bash script?
No. So right. So the thing I was using Docker Compose for was not just to define the service, but to define the dependent services and sort of link them together. So that if I wanted to take an entire service down, I could. If I wanted to update an entire service, I could, just by using Docker Compose. Take the whole thing down, make a new container, bring it back up again. Boom, it's updated.
But every time he did that, Dan Walsh cried.
Maybe. No, SE Linux was turned on. But anyway, so Podman doesn't have Docker Compose or Podman Compose. Well, it kind of does. There is a project called Podman Compose, which is not quite the same as Docker Compose, and it's not done as far as I can tell. It's not like it doesn't have feature parity to Docker Compose yet. So I thought there must be a Podman alternative to something like Docker Compose, something that I can link services together, something that I can, treat them all as a unit, right? And it turns out it does. Podman has a concept of pods, which is very similar to Kubernetes pods, which encapsulate a service, right? So I figured out how to take my Docker Compose information and turn it into a Podman pod definition. It's actually a Kubernetes pod definition, which then Podman is able to translate and turn into a Podman pod. And this was all a bit of a process because I had to figure out how to get what I had and make it a Kubernetes pod. And the documentation for Kubernetes pods is a bit too broad because Podman's implementation of the pods is a little more limited, right? So you can't just go and write a Kubernetes pod and expect it to work in Podman. Maybe you can, but it's limiting, right? So I basically went through this process where I manually defined, say, a WordPress pod, and then I used Podman itself to export it into a YAML file which defines a Podman Kubernetes pod, right? Then I brought it right back into Podman as a pod, right? So now I can define my services as Podman pods in these YAML files, which is really what I wanted to begin with. I wanted to be able to define all this in a YAML file. And so I can stop and start my pods using these things. And it's all good. I wrote a blog about it, and it's in the show notes. So it's on Underground, the main site. And it is the latest thing that I've written. So if you go to underground.org, you'll be able to see it. So, yes, I have Podman pods now. It's pretty cool. And I see Joshua is just behind us in the chat. Yes, I wrote a thing on it.
A thing. With the stuff.
A thing with the stuff. So yeah, his commentary is basically compose equals a pod, and he says he hopes I wrote a blog about it. Yes, I wrote a blog about it, and I don't know that I would say compose equals a pod. I would say that what I was using Docker Compose for equals a pod in Podman, right? And that was to group services and have a flat file that I could define them in, right? So now I can take this and put it on another Podman server and bring up the same service, assuming I move all my content over with it. So that is essentially what I'm doing. So, yes, Joshua, you can. In fact, I'm just going to take this link and put it in the chat. So yeah, that's what I've been working on.
And now Joshua has a project for the weekend.
Indeed. There you go. Have at it. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. That's pretty much the excitement that I've been going through. Looks like you've been doing stuff with 3D printers.
Yeah, it's about the only. I mean, trying to survive this post-apocalyptic wasteland without losing my mind.
Nah. I'm still doing okay with that.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It hit me yesterday, day before. I don't know. I feel like I have depression at this point. No, I had gotten an Inner 5, which I may have mentioned before. I printed a thing. It's neat. It actually came out really, really nice. And my son's been playing with 3D printers for a while, and he mentioned, and I've seen mentioned elsewhere, this thing called Octoprint, which is like a way to control your 3D printer from a Raspberry Pi, effectively wirelessly. So you put this distribution on the Raspberry Pi, plug it into your printer. It connects the Raspberry Pi connects to wireless, and then you can send all sorts of commands and everything else to the Raspberry Pi. Plus, you can do other cool things like hook up a video camera to it, take pictures of what's going on, see live video. It's pretty slick. So
It's pretty cool.
So I kind of went, that sounds cool. So I went and got a shiny new Raspberry Pi 4, and I got the recommended camera I saw, which is, I don't know if you've seen the Raspberry Pi cameras, which is like a little tiny board with a little brick on it. Yeah, this camera is that little tiny board with a camera on it. It's like about yay long.
That's cool.
It won't reach over. It's plugged in at the moment, so it won't reach over here. But it's this humongous camera. It looks like an SLR. So I'm printing parts now to try to arrange it so that I can have the camera pointing at the print as it's going, so I can get some decent captures of it. But it's cool. It does all sorts of neat stuff. So I've been playing around with that. It's got plugins and everything else. I'm gonna blow it up at some point, I'm sure. Yeah, it's what 3D printers are for. Like, look what I can do. Oh, it's on fire. Crap.
Oh no.
No, it might catch on literal fire.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Kidding. Yeah, there's warnings on Octoprint because enough people that the Internet Storm Center noticed it. A lot of people put Octoprint directly on the internet, and Octoprint has a like a username and password to log into it. So there's all manner of warnings when you're installing this thing that says, "Do not put this on the internet unless you know what you're doing."
Bad stuff.
A username and password is not enough.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they explained is, like, in order to load firmware onto your 3D printer, you have to plug into your 3D printer with a USB cable.
Mm-hmm.
Guess how Octoprint connects to your 3D printer?
Over the USB cable.
Right. So
people can put firmware on your 3D printer if they were
take over your Octoprint server. Use that to boot firmware onto the 3D printer that doesn't have the safeties on it.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't have the safeties on it.
Burn your house down.
Turn the thing on and have it heat up as much as possible, and you burn somebody's house down.
And nobody would do that. The internet is a safe place.
Yeah. It was the Internet Storm Center noticed an awful lot of Octoprint servers live on the internet, and apparently, this was a while ago. But
that's a conspiracy. That's not true.
Like, please don't do that.
Totally not true.
So yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm having fun with it. So
that's cool.
I also learned what not to do with a spool of filament, and that is let go at the end of it, because then it goes. Which
anyone who's owned a fishing rod knows that how that ended.
Okay, you wound it back up, but if you let go of the end of it and it somehow slips underneath another spool of wire, it binds up later on. So
yep.
Mark watched me rewind my spool a couple minutes ago.
Nice.
So that's about it. That and
that's cool.
Losing my mind at work.
Yeah, well, that'll happen. All right, so I guess in that case, we can move along into the news and try to tie this show up, because apparently we've been live for 2 hours already.
Yeah, but there was a lot of.
We did have like a half hour.
Yeah, there was the preteen girl meltdown.
Yes,
that was.
Yeah, we had a half hour or so transition in the middle there.
It felt like a half hour.
Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, my 9-year-old is trying to set up the Nintendo Switch so her and her cousins can play. Her cousins are also physically in the living room with her. And the controller wasn't working for her, so that was the reason to barge on in and have a meltdown.
Scream like a crazy person.
Luckily, it was during our break.
Did you make it work?
No, I was trying to make it work, and she gave up and said, let's just watch a movie. So they're watching a movie now.
Punted to watch a movie. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
That's a win condition. What were they watching?
I have no idea. I really don't know. I switched the TV back to the Roku and walked away. For
With
all I know,
disgust.
they're watching Basic Instinct right now.
And you don't care. You
They're girls. It has a different,
Yeah,
it's
right.
different when it's a girl.
Right. So, anyway. All right. In the effort of not having to use the transition screen again, I'm just going to play the button. I'm going to push the button that plays the music.
woo!
The aquamarine button.
And because I'm reminded of the fact that that I have the soundboard in front of me, I also want to play all of you our newest soundbite, which Mark has already heard on our soundboard, which is
Yay! Yay!
So we have that now. It's the first time I've added something to the soundboard since I made that transition music. So
For the first time in forever.
you trying
And
to
it's a
get
clip
that
of me,
on the
which is
soundboard
awesome.
as well?
A man can dream.
I was editing the show last week, and that was literally right before we transitioned last time. I forget what I said, but you responded with that as I was hitting the button, and I'm like, I have to make this a soundbite.
I approve. Seal of approval. Oh.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So now we have that. I can play that at will whenever I want.
Yay! It's
All
never
right.
not going to be funny.
All right, so our first news article for tonight comes from Computer Business Review, which I don't know if I've ever heard of
Is
before.
that even a real thing?
It goes by CBR. Maybe this is completely fake news, but it came across my Google search, so it must be true, right?
Is that the one with the horrified stock
Yes, it's the
Picture.
one with
Yeah.
the
Straight-
horrified woman in the.
stock photo?
Straight from the GM so shocked department.
Yeah,
What
right.
she was
So-
really what she had really just found out about the horrible STI that her weekend hookup gave her, but they used it for this computer
Yeah,
article.
that's probably it. This is like. This is a picture from that MTV teen mom show, right?
Yeah, something like.
Anyway, it's not about teen moms or STDs at all. It's about AWS is harvesting AI customers' content by default and storing it outside users' selected regions. So there's a few things to unpack here. One is that there are a number of products from Amazon, and I read them during the transition to you guys so that you would know what they
Now
were.
you have to scroll down.
Now I got to find
There-
where they
there-
were again. Here we go.
There are things like the Code Guru Profiler and Recognition and Transcribe, Fraud
Right.
Detector, and more.
Yeah. So the list that's in this article anyway is Code Guru Profiler, Lex, Poly, Recognition with a K, Textract, Transcribe, and Translate. And there's another section. They're talking all about the terms of service, right? And they say in section 6.4, so they've broken these apart by what section you can find them in. So the next list is just SageMaker, and then Fraud Detector, and Mechanical Turk. Oh, and Augmented AI. So these are all services which you can use on Amazon, which basically, you just, as you would on AWS, right? You plug in your credit card number and you can start doing AI, right? In the default terms of service, or in the terms of service, it says Amazon might or will mine the data that you put into this service. By default, this is turned on. And no one really noticed because who reads the terms of service?
The damn thing.
Right.
Well, it's only 15,000 words. I don't
Right.
understand why you wouldn't read this.
Right. There's like a generalized data privacy FAQ which doesn't mention it. Right? In fact, this FAQ says AWS gives you ownership and control over your content through simple, powerful tools that allow you to determine where your content will be stored. Okay? So the other piece to this thing is that this data, once it's mined and Amazon does its thing with it, could be stored in in a location other than what region you have started the service up in. So if you started it, say, within the U.S., Amazon could, and this is in theory, I'm not saying they're doing this, Amazon could be storing it in China, right? So like data sovereignty stuff, data sovereignty regulations for your business and your data could now be getting like broken because of where this data is being stored, right?
And guess whose fault that is?
Guess whose fault that is? Of
Guess whose
course,
fault that
it's the
is?
customer's fault because they
It
didn't
is
turn it off.
absolutely the customer's fault.
Right, because they didn't read the terms of service. Right, so I agree with that to an extent, but I still feel like this is shady, right? The fact that they buried it in the terms of service, and then on top of that, so the reason nobody really noticed it, or the reason people have noticed it now, I should say, the reason they didn't notice it because it's buried in the terms of service, but previously, to turn this off, you had to know it was on by default, and you had to open a support case with Amazon to turn it off, right? No big deal. It's not like they fought you over this or whatever. You'd ask and they turn it off. What they've done recently is they changed the UI, I guess, in the AWS Management Console so that it's now like a checkbox or a radio button that you just hit and it says, no, don't do this, or yes, you can go ahead and do this. And this got turned on for people's services, and they're like, what now? This is on by default? Why didn't you ever tell me this? And then, of course, that drew people's eye to this, and they found it in the terms of service. And ta-da, here we are.
And Jeff Bezos says, I did tell you.
I totally told you.
On his big pile of money.
Yeah, right. He went to his.
he dove into a Scrooge McDuck swimming pool.
We've been playing the click through the EULA game for how many years now?
Right,
forever.
Right. So I mean,
the companies know that and they take advantage of this. Microsoft does the same thing.
Oh no, I'm not saying that Amazon is the devil for this. I'm saying that Amazon is the latest one who's been caught doing it.
Go read the EULA for Windows 10.
I don't really want
because I don't know what's changed now, but like when it first came out, like all of your data belonged to them.
Mm-hmm.
All of it.
All your base
live typing data belonged to them.
Yeah, so I mean this really calls to attention the big thing, right? Companies have been doing this forever. Users have been ignoring it forever, and we don't learn our lessons.
Shocked Pikachu.
I've got it. Can we design an AI ML tool that will read the EULA for us?
Yes, and
summarize just give us the bad shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, dumbass! Don't click it before I talk to you.
It really does make
Get Chris Wright back on the phone.
Yeah, right. It really does make me wonder, right? Because
Chris, we got a job for you.
I have to imagine that there are companies that have used these services that maybe say have legal services on retainer or have a legal department of their own whose job it is to review this stuff. Right? Isn't that the way business is supposed to be carried out? Am I wrong here?
No. It depends on the size of the business, but yes.
Yeah.
So especially when you're dealing with content that is under that is auditable or under some sort of like PCI or HIPAA or some sort of government regulation, then yes, you have entire departments dedicated to compliance.
Right. So I guess my question is, did they all miss this? Or did they see it and say, yeah, we need to make sure we turn this off before we go live, and just never said anything to the world at large?
No, they most likely missed it. They most likely missed it. I mean, the one thing, and I'm not going to talk, it's not every company, but the one thing that I've noticed a lot about compliance is that they don't always check these things directly themselves.
Yeah.
They'll rely on going to, the IT guy, because remember, the way that big companies work, you've got a compliance department, which are all of they're more legal experts than anything else.
Right. They don't
not
necessarily understand
technical.
the technology.
Right.
Okay.
You've got the security department. You've got the security department that has to enforce all this stuff that the compliance department wants, and you've got the IT department that implements things.
So the legal person, the security group goes to the legal people and say, hey, can you review this thing and let us know if we're getting anything crazy? The legal group goes to the IT person and says, hey, can you review this thing and see if we're getting anything crazy?
No, it's much easier.
And the IT guy is like, I don't got time for this shit.
It's much easier than that. When something gets implemented, the compliance guy says, okay, we're going to implement this. What tools are you using? Okay, so they don't store anything anywhere, right? Oh, no, of course not.
Yeah, right.
Like the IT guy read 15,000 lines of legalese. Give me a break.
Right,
The
exactly.
the security team just practices saying no.
Yeah, right. The security people just said no.
Well, that's
Patch
not
it.
always true, but
Yeah,
No.
right. No,
Yeah.
and patch.
Patch it. No.
yeah. Now, some of the more edge companies are starting to well, first of all, they're realizing that compliance is security and security is compliance. Duh.
War
So
is
they're
peace.
combining those departments
Freedom is
together.
slavery.
And then beyond that, they're starting to integrate security with IT, and then you have this sort of amalgam of compliance, security, and IT all together, and then you can move much faster and make much better decisions that way.
So what we need is an IT lawyer. Is that what you're saying?
They exist, but yes,
Probably very
Most of them are
expensive.
sucked up by Oracle.
honestly, what we need is
for nefarious term means,
For
right?
nefarious,
So-
yeah, Oracle's nefarious. They just
Do you
they're
remember?
just
Do
sucking
you remember a
money out
couple
of
years ago when privacy policies started getting simpler? I swear there was a law or something that was passed that said that they just had to be in clear,
Sort of like the Truth in
clear
Lending Act.
terms.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of
something along
that-
those lines.
Didn't a lot of that come from like a lot of the European based?
It's possible.
Could be.
Right. But they get around it by having
Later,
a clear
Josh.
privacy policy that says, oh, you have complete control over everything. Right. And of course, it's small and concise, very quick. And then they have the terms of service, which is like, 12 books written in tiny, tiny print that nobody
Right.
ever reads, where it says, you totally have control of the service if you sacrifice a goat at midnight during a blood moon, blah, 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 etc.
Right.
So, they told you.
They told you. You just
You didn't read it.
Yeah, you're right. It does fall on the user, and that's unfortunate, right? It's unfortunate that we can say, yes, we told you, but we can do it in such a way where you are pretty sure nobody read it.
Right. And
Right.
I don't mean to crap on the user and say it's all your fault. I think it is arguably unethical to have this as a default opt-in. I think
Yes.
when it comes to something like this, I know why they're doing it. I mean, when it comes down to they need to make money and
Mhm.
this is how they make money, I
Right.
understand why they're
The
doing
customer is the product in that case.
it. Right. Exactly.
It's okay. What's the European stuff called? Oh,
GDPR?
Yeah, GDPR.
GDPR, because GDPR says the default has to be no.
Well,
You have to default. It has to be default opt out.
GDPR says it has to be default opt out when it comes to privacy and user data.
Yes,
You
private,
could-
right?
you could
Private, and user data is very, very specifically identified.
Right. So
PI.
AI
Down to like your IP address is considered private
right.
information.
So data you've asked AI to crunch on may not be protected data, but it may be sensitive to your business, but it may not be protected from a person's standpoint.
Also keep in mind that the terms of service that you sign in the U.S. is different from the terms of service that you sign sitting in Britain.
Certainly.
So it's entirely possible that it's default opt out overseas.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that it's definitely shady on Amazon's
Yes.
part.
I
Yeah,
call
it
this
is-
shady.
it is shady.
I definitely call it shady. So that's my
Buyer
latest.
beware, right? Buyer
That's my
beware.
latest rant against AWS. It's no secret I don't like AWS.
Have you tried Azure?
Have I tried
Yeah.
Azure? I have not. I would
You might
probably
like
hate
AWS
it just as
after
much.
that.
Oh no!
And that's the
And not-
best. That's as close to a sales pitch for AWS you'll get out of Jason.
No, I actually
It's
I
the
do
it's
like
the least
AWS.
worst.
Well, as we'll
that's
find
why I
out
told-
later, Oracle has a cloud too, so there's definitely a worst.
Oh yeah. If Oracle has a cloud, that's definitely one that I will never be a
You're
tenant
the
on.
worst there. Well, it's like, when I talk about satellite to people, it's like it's had issues, but it's in a swim lane that is hard. So it could be like the least shittiest product in a difficult place.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's a very complicated system, right? is what it comes down to. So it's very easy for it to do something
like
badly. But most of what it does pretty well.
Yeah, things like SAP, you know. SAP, if you've ever worked that out, is a nightmare. But that, again, is probably
the best in its
least,
class. Right?
Is the least shittiest ERP platform.
Yeah.
The least bad.
The least bad. It's kind of like video conferencing software. All of them kind of suck, but you find the one that sucks the least, and that's the one you use.
The one that's the least bad.
Yeah. So, on to the next article. This is from Forbes. Google's internet balloons use AI. I wonder if it's AI hosted on AWS. You think Google would put AI on AWS? I hope not.
Now, how are they using AI?
I don't know.
I feel like that's in a very buzzword.
I feel like if we would have read the article a little more closely, we could have answered that question. But
Oh,
let me
they
finish
work
the headline,
together.
which is to deliver web voice video from 12 miles high. And the concept, at least that I understand from this article, is that Google has launched balloons that will help deliver internet access to places that traditionally were hard to deliver internet access to because they don't have infrastructure.
Yep,
I don't know if this is the
thus far
culmination.
successful.
I don't know if this is the culmination of a project that I heard about years ago or if it's a different project, but I remember hearing about a similar thing. I don't know, it might have been 10 years ago. Somebody was launching balloons that were going to give internet access.
Yeah,
I thought it was Facebook.
This was one of no, it was Google's moonshot, and it was Project Loon.
Okay. Good.
So yeah, they've been doing this for a while.
So
well,
done!
they've been
Yay!
working on this for a while.
Okay.
And of course, I mean, yes, it's got AI. And just remember, if it's Google, it's all behind the scenes being controlled by Borg.
Right.
So the Borg run everything.
The Borg run everything, which means they're not putting their AI on AWS.
Right.
No, not a chance.
Resistance is futile.
Resistance is futile. Yeah. Borg, which is their container platform, right? Isn't that what Borg is?
Well,
Or the
Borg
automation
is their
container
orchestration platform. But
Right.
yeah, that's pretty much all of Google.
Yeah. So the Borg runs the balloons, which give us internet access in places that's hard to get to, which is cool. Like I really like the idea, right? I don't know if I love that it's Google that's doing it, because, and even though I'm an Android user, Google of course has its problems with privacy and with the fact that, you know, people are not customers, but they are revenue, right? So you know, that's problematic for me. So it may be a great thing, right, to give internet access to places that don't have it, or underprivileged countries, or whatever, right? So that's cool, that's great. But I am concerned about what they're doing with whatever data they might be trying to collect from it. I have to say that there's a lot of cases where Google comes up with a service that is either free or very cheap, right? But the trade-off is that the data you transfer through it is considered theirs, and they're mining it for ad revenue and whatever. So that's
Yeah.
I mean, like
Google-
AWS.
Yeah.
like
Google
AWS
also-
is doing now.
Google also tends to have the attention span of a 6-year-old sometimes, where they'll
Exactly.
deploy a technology, get bored with it, and then just abandon it.
Right. So that could be a
Yeah,
problem.
how's that new video game service of theirs?
Still running.
Yeah, but it's like they forgot about it already.
I don't know. It keeps getting new games.
Is it picking up now? 'Cause,
I don't
the
know if
last I
you-
heard about it, it was like
I don't know if you'd call it picking up. So the one thing I don't do a lot of is play online games, right? So I don't know if there's like a whole bunch of there's an influx of users or anything on the platform, but I can say that it's constantly getting new games, new to the platform anyway, not necessarily new games, right? There's a couple of titles that I recognize, but most of them are not brand new, and there's a bunch of indie games, which is kind of cool, right? Because you can get exposure to these lesser known games, which is, you know, kind of fun in itself. But it is pretty neat, I have to say. And I love the concept, which is really the main reason that I keep using it, because I just love the concept that I have almost no hardware here that's making this thing work, right? It's literally streaming all of it from a server somewhere.
I don't love that I have to buy a game again that I already own
Yes.
to use Stadia.
That's
sucks.
That's my biggest complaint with it, right? My biggest complaint,
Says
is
the guy
that-
who's bought Skyrim probably 8 times.
yeah, is that
But that's different.
is
That's
that
Skyrim.
the games are locked into the Stadia ecosystem, right? And if Google does turn off Stadia, the games
when
go
they
away.
turn off Stadia.
Right, when they turn off Stadia, the games are going to go away, right? So the way I've dealt with that is I claim the free games that they give, which they do frequently, and I don't buy games. I don't buy games through Stadia.
That's probably the smartest way to do it.
Right? So the free games have been fun. They're all like titles you've never heard of, or titles that I've never heard of anyway. But they're fun little games to play and whatever. But I think on games I've probably spent under $100 on Stadia, and that was because when I first joined it, they had that relaunch of the Tomb Raider games. Ever since Tomb Raider was the one that released, I think it was like 2012 or something. Ever since that one, all of the games that have gone in that, which I'm a big fan of Tomb Raider games, I purchased those, but they were all like $10 a piece, so it wasn't really a big deal, right? So I bought those on Stadia, but otherwise everything I've done has been free. And that was mainly because I wanted to really try out the ecosystem, and I figured this Tomb Raider game would be a good one to do that on, because I like the games anyway. So, anyway, that's not
the
what
last
we're
I
talking
heard. Yeah, the last I heard about Stadia was that they finally released some launch day features that weren't there for launch day. So
yeah, so there's a number of disappointments with Stadia, like using the controller, right? So the whole point was that you had this controller, and that was really the only piece of hardware you needed. And really, you don't even need that, right? But that was the thing that made it feel like a game system. You could play on a browser, you could play on your phone, you could play through a Chromecast, and that was it. All you really needed was the controller and a Stadia account or a subscription, a Stadia Pro subscription. But the controller, while it's a really nice controller, it doesn't work wirelessly with anything except the Chromecast. You have to plug it physically into your phone. You have to plug it physically into your laptop if you're going to play that way. So, like, that was a real big disappointment in my opinion. And there were a number of other features that they didn't deliver on. I think they still haven't.
That's because nobody ever came out with a standard for wireless things like that.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It's a shame. Shame no one did that. So, anyway, that's why internet balloons are using AI to deliver web, voice, and video. It has nothing to do with Stadia, but it has a lot to do with Google.
Yes, it does. It is cool. I mean, I've seen, like, they were talking about it years ago, and I guess I was reading some more that this is the first non-emergency use of Loon that they've had. But the balloons use AI. Basically, the AI is used to teach the balloons how to manage themselves. So they increase the size of the balloon to go up and go down, where they can catch different airflows and move the balloons around and stay in certain areas.
That's pretty cool.
So that makes me wonder if the Flame Boss device I use for my big green egg, if they claim that it's artificially intelligent because it learns how to maintain the temperature of the grill, because it seems like magic to me.
It's totally AI, and it's stored on AWS, and Amazon now has a whole bunch of information about your meat.
Oh, hey now.
Read that however you'd like.
So, speaking of data,
right?
Mr. Data
from CNN Business. See, I did the thing where
you did. Congratulations! It's only been 4 years. You finally learned.
Facebook, Google, and Twitter won't give Hong Kong authorities user data.
For now.
For now, right? I love how they add that, for now.
He says ominously.
At the moment, we're going to take this very popular stance where we're not going to give user data away.
Right. What the title doesn't say is that they were giving that data.
Yeah.
And they're pausing giving that data. At least Facebook. It doesn't say. Yes, Twitter was doing it as well.
It says it in the headline. It's true.
And Google. Yep, Google. Also, everybody seems to be pausing giving data to the authorities in Hong Kong.
Right.
Which means that they were.
Right.
So
I mean,
they reserve the right to do so in the future.
So think about it, right? Everything's fine, right? The government's doing what the government's supposed to do. It's not oppressing its people. It's not doing nasty things. Companies like this probably have agreements where they have, they will give that data over, right? Then the government does crazy things that they don't agree with, and they stop doing it, right? So this is like the kind of thing I would kind of expect, right? So yes, they
Yeah,
were
sort
giving
of.
the data. Now they're not because they don't agree with what the government is doing, right? And they
Yeah,
may
well,
do
this
it
is
again when the government goes back to a normal status quo, right?
right. So, but I
As
mean,
normal as
part
it
of the
gets in
issue
Hong
is
Kong.
right. So if you go before all of the protests and everything else, when China was trying to do whatever China was trying to do in Hong Kong, which is what, many months ago now.
Oh, it's like a year.
Yes, yeah. So prior to that, the status quo, it was what the status quo was. It doesn't sound like it was any more horrible than what happens in the U.S.
Right.
But I think when the protesting started and everything else, the fact that and I this is speculation, but I suspect that the law enforcement started using this, started requesting more and more information, and it's
Well,
only taken until now when they've passed this apparently controversial security law, for them to go, oh wait, maybe we should not give this data. And
yeah.
I think that's sort of at least for me, that's sort of the takeaway, is like it took something like this for them to go,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe we shouldn't do that.
I got to think about what level of red tape they have to go through to get this kind of thing done.
Right. There's the
Like,
you cannot run a business and do business with people in Hong Kong.
I've seen even in small organizations changes that seem simple or seem like common sense get drugged through a whole procedure of red tape before they can be done, right? And as an organization gets more and more complex, that gets even longer, right? As long as there's policy surrounding getting changes made, right? So I could imagine that companies dealing with governments, right? It's not like a switch. They can just go like, nope, we're not doing that anymore, because they got to cover a bunch of bases. Right now, I'm not trying to defend giving away private data on citizens to a corrupt government, right? Because that's obviously a bad thing. But I can also understand why it couldn't have been just a switch, right? Maybe it could have been. Maybe Google and Facebook and Twitter could have been like, I don't like what you guys are doing. We're going to stop giving you data right now. But could there have been backlash of some manner that would have gotten them into a lot of trouble? I don't know.
Well, Google's
just
done this
speculating.
before where Google's done this before where they backed out of China. So
yeah. Well, I don't know. At any rate, they've stopped now, and they'll probably start doing it again in the future. Who knows when? We'll keep an eye on it. And by keep an eye on it, I mean if I get a Google alert in 6 months that says they've done it again, we'll tell you about it.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
Otherwise, I'll miss it, and you won't hear about it on this show.
all right, let's switch topics and talk about racks.
Yes, racks. So this is from Blocks and Files. I don't know. Again, this was a Google alert that came up, and it caught my interest because I really think that it sounds ironic. Amazon adds on-premises RDS database support to AWS Outposts. So if you're not familiar with AWS Outposts, this is putting AWS's cloud on-prem, which is
a complete friggin' contradiction.
Which is exactly what AWS was meant to eliminate, was on-prem. So now, not only can you run like instance and storage and whatnot on-prem in your AWS Outpost, you can also run RDS databases on-prem in your AWS Outpost. So,
But look, you still get charged an hourly fee for each managed database.
Well, yeah, and then on top of that, the power and cooling and whatever to manage your AWS Outpost.
Just friggin' set up OpenStack. Come on.
Yes.
You can't make too much fun of AWS for this because they're just following suit to what Microsoft does with Azure Stack and what Oracle does with Cloud at Customer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or
hey, did you know Oracle has a cloud?
Right.
I've heard.
Or you could design your services in such a way that they don't depend on AWS to the point where you have to extend AWS into your freaking data center.
So there are.
If only there were open systems and software.
If only there was a vendor that sold an open hybrid cloud solution.
Fine. I mean, if you're talking that way, fine. But I mean, if you're talking cloud versus on-prem, there are definitely valid reasons to have on-prem servers.
No, yeah, absolutely.
A lot of it has to do with latency and security.
No, and that's what this. I'm pretty sure that's what this is meant to solve, right? So you have a database, which is generally you need to have fast access to. You have something on-prem, whether it's, like your end user or an application or whatever, and you need quick access to it. You want to bring it on-prem, right? And when you're locked into an ecosystem like Amazon, the only choice you have is to extend Amazon into your data center. That's the point I'm trying to make. If you hadn't made that choice to begin with, you wouldn't have to buy an application, extend it into your data center or on-prem or whatever in order to facilitate a thing that was dirt simple 10 years ago.
So what makes it better, or
For
funnier,
Bezos,
I guess, is when you look at this and realize that Outpost is like $7,000 a month for the cheap version, right? But then on top of it, if you want something like RDS, you're now paying 7.5 cents a minute for RDS access on the $7,000 rack a month, or $7,000 a month rack that you've purchased from Amazon.
That you've purchased from Amazon.
7.5 cents an hour, it looks
like. And that you stood up per hour, and that you stood up in your data center, which you're paying money to cool, and you're paying money to power, and you're paying money to secure.
And by the way, that's a MySQL instance, which you could friggin' self-host.
Well, RDS is not just MySQL. RDS has
this is the 7.5 cents per hour for a MySQL.
Oh, okay.
Right, and 8 gig of memory.
Right.
Yeah, but
I understand the whole RDS is your managed database service, but
Yeah. Oh, it only supports MySQL and PostgreSQL,
which are two open source solutions that you can run on-prem anyway.
Not on.
I just think it's funny that you're renting the hardware and then having to pay for the software that you're renting on the hardware that you're renting.
And to power it and cool it and to secure it.
And I'm sure there's fools that are racing to hand that money to Amazon.
Yeah, I think I know one of them, but I digress.
Oh, I guess I would know him too.
Yeah,
huh?
I think you know him too.
Fool is a very nice term.
I don't work for him anymore. I can call him a fool. I
being
can call
a
him whatever
family,
I want, right?
Being a family-friendly show, I'm not gonna.
Oh, you probably have much worse names for him than I do.
Now, to be fair, one of my players works for Amazon, and he's also a fellow Scout parent, so I do like that, he can provide for his family.
Yes, I do like that they employ him, and he seems like a very smart person. It seems like he's doing very well, and
I've been trying to get him to come to Red Hat too.
He'd be a fool to leave Amazon, considering the conversations that we've had with him. But I do hate the people he works for.
Wow.
I'm sorry. I've got feelings about AWS, and I think I've made that clear on this show.
It seems like.
All right, so on to our last article for the night. This comes from TechCrunch. Docker partners with AWS to improve container workflows, and this is basically Docker trying to remain relevant in a container world where everyone's moving to the cloud, and a lot of people, especially those that are using Red Hat's applications or Red Hat's platform, are moving to Podman. Someday I'm going to have to find out what the rub was between Red Hat and Docker as to why we went with Podman, but that's for another show.
We should have Dan Walsh on.
We should totally
or Scott McCarty.
I mean, we've already had Chris Wright, so we may as well. I mean, we can go down from there, right? And if someone says no, we're like, look, Chris Wright did it.
I don't know if it's down there, but yeah, I see what you mean.
Down hierarchically. I can't say
and
that.
Dan would be hilarious because he'd be there
awesome.
with his Boston accent and everything, and he's a guy.
Great. So
fun.
Anyway, this is basically an article about how Docker and AWS are working together to make Docker Compose work better with AWS resources like Fargate and ECS. So. I guess previously Docker Compose was not something that translated easily into ECS or Fargate, and they're working together to make that not so much of a hurdle anymore. Fargate is a hosted container service, which is ridiculously expensive if you ask me. Basically, a container costs about what an EC2 instance does. At least it did when I looked at it a long time ago.
Yeah. So ECS itself is. You pay for the EC2 instances, of which you have to have believe at least 2, maybe 3, and it sets up Docker Swarm on it for you and
Yeah.
manages it.
Yeah.
And then it launches the containers, which it then charges you for
Yep.
on the EC2 instances
Right.
that you've been paying for. All of this, again, this is the whole, like, you can do this yourself in your basement.
Yes.
And what
There's
Fargate does...
There's EKS as well, which is a hosted
That's Kubernetes.
solution,
Right.
which
That's-
is a similar model to what you just described, except it's Kubernetes instead of Swarm.
It's there's actually good differences there, and EKS isn't horrible.
Okay.
And EKS alone, Kubernetes is not for the faint of heart.
Right.
So EKS, okay, a child could manage a Swarm cluster. It is stupid simple.
Okay.
Kubernetes, hardened engineers have issues with. So
Yes.
Kubernetes as a managed service is something that is actually a good thing to offer. Fargate added, it changes that model somehow. I'm not 100% sure. I think what Fargate gives you is the fact that you don't have to, I don't think you have to spin up EC2 instances.
Right. You spin
It
up
launches
containers.
You spin up the containers, and it gives you some extra networking capabilities and
Yeah,
stuff to do things that
takes-
you would have expected to want to do on ECS to begin with.
It takes the veil, and when I say the veil, I mean the point where you're dealing with an endpoint at AWS and not a service, and it moves it up one level, from what I remember when I looked at this.
Yeah.
Fargate is basically a container service where you say, "Here's my container, please run it for me."
Yes, and but the last time I looked, and I don't know if they've changed this. The last time I looked, you couldn't attach a Fargate container to storage. Which,
Okay.
So it's great for microservices, stateless microservices.
Right.
If you need anything, if you're dealing with anything that needs storage, and let's face it, it's most of the containers out there.
Yeah.
You're kind of screwed.
But
and then again, EKS, the managed part of it is the, I don't know what they call them anymore. I don't think they're actually called master nodes anymore. Head nodes, maybe. But that cluster of
The control plane.
orchestration nodes, the actual control plane, is managed by AWS, and then the individual EC2 instances that you spin up are the worker nodes that you run your load on.
Right.
Load.
So at any rate, I have not found a solution that runs containers on AWS to be cost effective. is what I've decided. Running my own systems to run containers has always been cheaper. Now you don't get the cluster feature though, right? So if I were running a cluster, I guess that's a little different.
But again, if you want cost efficient containers on AWS, you're talking about containers that are spun up, do their work, and spin down.
Yeah.
You and I run containers that are
I run containers that are 24/7 services.
Yeah, that's not cost effective on AWS no matter what you do. Just spin up an EC2 instance.
Yeah, exactly. There's and even I don't think EC2 is even cost effective for that. There's much cheaper ways to do it.
Well,
there's cheaper cloud providers to do it on.
Right. If you're talking about AWS, no, there's not a cheaper way to do it. It's
right.
Just run an EC2 instance.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, there's cheaper cloud providers.
Yeah.
You're right.
So, at any rate, that covers the news for tonight. And to be honest, we've been going on this it's got to be at least 2 hours of recorded time at this point.
Oh yeah.
We've been live for 2 hours and 40 minutes. So, I think it's time to wrap up the show. So, folks, if you're listening audio and you want to catch us live, you can do so on the second and fourth Thursday of every month, unless life gets in the way. But you can do so via youtube.com/Iron Sysadmin Podcast. I'm also tinkering with multi-streaming, maybe as soon as our next episode, where we can also stream to Twitch. I know some people don't like YouTube because it's Google. They don't like YouTube because of things they've done to, quote-unquote,
yeah, but Twitch is now Amazon.
Yes, Twitch is now Amazon. But it's an end to a means, correct? So
means to an end.
Means to an end. Yes, that's the right word. So I may end up streaming there as well, and maybe other platforms that I can do via the platform I'm looking at, which of course is Restream, because I don't know that anybody else does this thing. If anybody knows of a service that does it, I'd be happy to compare. So anyone who does multi-streaming, let me know, and I can look into them. But I've been looking at Restream.io for now. At any rate. For now, it's on YouTube, and I will let everybody know once we've expanded, if we expand. If you want to join our Slack workspace to have conversations with us and, sort of get some behind the scenes stuff or chat with us or whatever, you can do so via ironsysadmin.com/Slack. Find us on Twitter and Facebook. Just look for Iron Sysadmin. On Twitter, we are at Iron Sysadmin. And on Facebook, you just have to kind of search for it. So there's links for those in the show notes if you want to go to them directly. It's getting hard to talk, folks. Subscribe to us wherever you can find podcasts. I did find out, I was looking into how we get listed on Spotify, and it turns out that either I did this already or Libsyn did it for me. We're on Spotify, so you can find us on Spotify. Maybe you're already listening to us on Spotify. And every time I've said, I don't know if we're on Spotify, you looked at your phone like, what? Of course you're on Spotify. I'm listening to you on Spotify. Anyway, we're on
Live
Spotify.
Journal someday.
Someday we'll be on Live Journal. And don't forget, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so via Patreon, patreon.com/Iron Sysadmin. We are maybe a third of the way to buying that new mixer I keep talking about. So every month it gets a little closer. And with that, I think we're done. I think I've covered everything we need to cover. I think I've had enough arguments with my children during the show tonight. And I think I'm ready to call it a night. So I think it was a pretty good show. What do you guys think? You guys being the co-hosts that I'm actually speaking to.
I think we're both still going to have a job tomorrow, so I consider that a success.
That's a plus. That's a plus. We had a guest that could have gotten us fired, and we didn't, as far as I know, get fired.
Yeah. Yay!
Yay! And that was like perfect, right?
That was live.
Yay!
I mean, it was almost like you're the one that's in that clip.
Almost. Almost.
All right, folks. I think we're going to call it a night. Thanks for listening or watching, and we will catch you next week.
Night all.